Today we're going to be talking about measuring and auditing your school's environmental impact, as Johanna has said. And just to give you a little introduction to me, for those who don't know me, well, I'm from England, as you can probably tell, but I've spent almost my entire adult life living abroad and working in the language travel industry. I started out as a teacher, like many of us did, that ended up pretty quickly going into management. And before long, I was running a group of multinational schools based in Barcelona, which is where I still live. Since 2018, I've changed tack a little bit. I'm still involved in the management of some schools, but I'm also now working on a number of Erasmus KA2 projects, which are good fun. And then I also was involved in starting this association, Green Standard Schools, last year. So that's by way of introduction. So yes, the subject today is measuring and auditing. I suppose the first question we should ask ourselves is, why measure things? Well, I suppose you're all familiar with this expression. You can only manage what you can measure. And we could probably spend the next 10 minutes discussing that item. I mean, my wife, for example, would probably claim that she can manage me pretty well without actually measuring what I do on a daily basis. But as far as business practice is concerned, it does sort of make sense, doesn't it? And this expression is attributed to management guru Peter Drucker, who I'm sure you've all heard of. Although, in fact, that's not quite what he said. He said something slightly nuanced, but this is a sort of shorthand version of what he said. What he said is probably more like this: you can't really know whether or not you're doing something successful in business unless success is first defined and then tracked or monitored. And success for us in the context in which we are talking is clearly lessening the environmental impact of our schools. So once we've agreed that that is the object of the exercise, then we have to try and work out how to track things to gauge how well we're doing. So what sort of things should we measure? Well, the first one on my list is your total student hours. And that might surprise some of you, but it's fairly obvious that if you want to think about in terms of reducing your energy consumption, your water consumption, that sort of thing, it has to be really in relation to the number of student hours you're giving in your schools. I mean, we all know from recent experience that it's fairly easy to reduce your energy bill if your school's closed and you don't have anyone in the classrooms. So it's important to have total student hours measured as a point of reference. And then we have a number of other items which are fairly logical. I'm sure you could all guess them. Things like your energy consumption, your water consumption, paper consumption, the volume of waste you generate and hopefully recycle. And then things like greenhouse gases generated by your travel, by students and staff, flights, and so on. Now, in theory, all of these things are fairly easy to measure and can be measured fairly objectively. And we'll look at exactly how to do that a little bit later. But apart from these sort of standard issues that we all want to measure, there are other things which I suggest we should also be measuring, such as the number of lessons given in your schools that are focused on environmental themes. Clearly, we have a huge opportunity to talk about environmental issues with our students, and it seems silly not to take the opportunity to do that on a rather more frequent basis. So I think that's one thing you could begin to log. And then slightly less objectively, but also importantly, the impact of your policies on staff and students, and also the impact of your policies on other suppliers, such as, for example, your accommodation providers. Now, as I say, we'll be looking at exactly how we can do that in a short while, but these are the sort of things that I suggest we should all be trying to monitor and record. What not to measure? Well, thousands of things, but in a nutshell, anything that would take more effort than it's worth. And some examples I put down here are such as the environmental impact of teaching online. Now, we all know that anything that happens online, such as this meeting today, has a carbon footprint. And if you use Zoom, it is, working on a server based in some huge warehouse somewhere, which probably is consuming energy at a rapid rate. But the impact of you doing it for your classes is probably not that considerable. So it's probably not worth your time and effort to do that. And then a couple of slightly flippant examples. If you're buying your teachers pizza to encourage them to come to a staff meeting, for example, the fact that it's going to take energy to make the pizza and deliver it perhaps is, obvious, but not worth calculating. And then the last one I've got here is the environmental impact of your students washing their clothes. Clearly, we want to encourage students to wash their clothes. And we all know that if they do it on low temperatures with an overnight, perhaps when the energy costs are slightly lower, that's a good idea. But things like, the number of microfibers that are going into the water system, it's just beyond us to measure these things, and there's not that much point. So you could probably come up with a whole bunch of other things which are perhaps not that interesting to measure. Okay, how to measure? Well, this first example is something I put together for measuring your electricity consumption in kilowatt hours. And as you can see there, 2 years, 2020, 2021, and I've put down a fictional number of kilowatt hours that this fictional school is generating over this period of time. And if you can scroll across to the right, if you can see that, and if you can't, then perhaps you should hide the video links. You can see that the total kilowatt hours in 2020 was 7,798, and that rose to 8,607 in 2021. So it looks as if we're going in the wrong direction. But then if you measure also that against your student hours, which I've listed below, see the student hours in 2020 were fairly low because of the impact of COVID. They crept back up in 2021 to 11,500. And then if you work out the ratios, you'll see that although the actual amount of energy that's being consumed in the school went up, the ratio of energy consumed per student hour went down. So that's, as I suggested earlier, one of the reasons why it's important to have at least some idea of your total student hours, so you can work out these sorts of ratios. Okay. How to measure, example number 2 is measuring your carbon emissions. This is from a website called Flight Emissions Calculator. There are all sorts of websites out there that will make these calculations for you these days. And as you can see, the example I put on the screen is a one-way flight from Barcelona to London Gatwick would generate 169.7 kilograms of CO2e. And if you're not familiar with CO2e, that's the little note at the bottom of the screen. It stands for carbon dioxide equivalent, because flights emit all sorts of gases apart from carbon dioxide. There are things like nitrous oxide and what have you. But rather than measuring every single gas separately, these sites tend to come up with a carbon dioxide equivalent to lump it all in the same calculation. So it's very easy to do these sorts of things these days. All you've got to do is find one of these websites and say log the results on your Excel sheet or whatever you decide to use. An example of how to measure something different, well, in this case, it's the impact of your policies, for example, on your students. And what I suggest you can do in this case is simply get them to complete one of these simple online questionnaires. The one that I have on screen is based on our website called orform.com. If you're not familiar, that's worth checking out. Because you can do up to 10 questions completely free. And then if you want to go a bit further, the charges are fairly minimal. So you could have a little questionnaire asking, for example, your students if environmental is important to them, what they think of the efforts you're making, if they're conscious of the efforts you're making, and so on. You devise your own questions. So this is also, I think, worth considering. Okay, and then apart from measuring, of course, you've also got to do other things. So, and I usually describe this as a 3-step process. So the first step is to measure these sorts of issues, these sorts of items. In other words, monitoring and recording your energy consumption, water consumption, paper consumption, etc. Step 2 is then to set targets to reduce your consumption, or perhaps in the case of flights, offset any unavoidable emissions. And then step 3, last but not least, you design strategies to achieve these targets. So I've got a couple of examples now we can talk through briefly. So the first one is an example of a strategy to reduce your water consumption. Now, if you're based in the UK, I suppose you don't worry too much about water because it seems to come out of the sky fairly regularly. But we all know that there are periods of the year when there are droughts, and with global warming and so on, it's likely to become more and more of an issue over time. So if you're not doing this already, it's something which is worth doing. And of course, if you reduce your consumption, then you're going to reduce your bills as well. So you could actually save some money at the same time. So yeah, step 1, as we've said, monitor and record the amount of water you're consuming in your school over a certain period, whether it's a year or 6 months, whatever you decide. And in the example I put here for 2021, I've suggested that the school, this fictional school, used a total of 282 cubic meters of water. And step 2 then, once you know what you're supposed to be dealing with, what you know it's supposed to be managing, you could then start to discuss with your staff and agree on a target to reduce this consumption, obviously again in relation to student hours. More students, you're likely to consume more water. The important point is to get the ratio of consumption per student hour to go down. So having had this discussion, staff and everybody else agrees that a target of a reduction of 6% is feasible for 2022, let's say, which would be nearly 17 cubic meters. So that would give you a maximum volume allowed with your target of 265 cubic meters. Again, that would be assuming a similar total of student hours. And then step 3, once you've established your target, would be to agree, again, discuss and agree on a strategy or strategies to achieve the target. And you're all familiar with various ways that you can cut back on your water consumption. For example, you can install those taps that shut off automatically and or aerators in taps. Aerators are really very cheap solutions, and they cut the volume of water coming out of most taps by about 50% without stopping the pressure, without reducing the pressure. So that's an easy fix. Obviously, fixing taps that drip, and then things that perhaps you have already done in many cases, like having dual flush systems in toilets, or one which is very cheap and easy, just put a large object such as a stone in all the toilet systems. That will displace a certain amount of the water coming in and means that there's less water going out every time it's flushed. Another idea, if you have the wherewithal to do it and the space, perhaps capture rainwater to water your plants, wash your electric car, and so on. And then also raise awareness by creating posters which you could put around the school. And I added this photo, because this comes from Jose Brinkman in his school. He's managed to get this large tank which captures the rainwater that falls on his building. And as Jose was one of the first members of Green Standard Schools to become accredited in the UK, I thought he merited the recognition of what he's doing, at least in this regard.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can I add that is 2 tanks in there, and each tank is 1,000 liters of water.
There
so
you go.
We've got water to, you can imagine.
Yep, brilliant, brilliant, great initiative. Okay, so that's a little strategy in terms of measuring the water consumption, setting a target to reduce it, and then agreeing on strategies how to reduce it. And clearly the key thing here is to get your staff and students involved as far as possible, get them to participate in all these steps, perhaps apart from the first one, monitoring, which is up to you. Okay, and here's another example. In this case, we're talking about a strategy to offset greenhouse gases generated by flights. So again, step 1, monitor and record the flights your school is responsible for. over a particular period. And again, I've got an example here, say, let's look into the future. Q1, unless something horrible goes wrong, we might have 34 short haul flights coming in to the country. Students are coming to study with us, and 38 long haul flights. Then using one of those sites that I've already mentioned, you can calculate the CO2e that these flights generate. And it really isn't that difficult to do, as I've said. And so it's in this particular case, with that number of flights, it's likely to be something in the region of 27 metric tons. So then you need to decide, you don't want to reduce it in this case, probably because you don't want to discourage students from coming to study with you. Of course, if they can come by ground transport, by train, by ferry, by bus or whatever, that's the way to go. But in some cases, it's simply not practical. I mean, how you get someone from a place like Saudi Arabia to come and study in your school without flying, it's simply just not feasible, is it? So we have to recognize that and just deal with it. And the way to deal with it is to have an offsetting strategy. So once you've got a vague idea of what the carbon emissions generated are, then you decide how to deal with it, how to offset it. And the next screen is from carbonfootprint.com, which has a whole range of very nice ideas of how you can offset carbon generated. And as you can see here, I put in the figure of 27 tons. And the cost of offsetting that depends on the project. They have something called a global portfolio, which, as the name suggests, deals with a whole range of different programs in all sorts of places. And the cost in this case would be £9 per tonne, or £243 for the 27 tonnes. If you want to go into something like UK tree planting, the cost is going to be slightly more expensive. Reforestation in Kenya, it's sort of in the middle there, but there's a whole long list of things that you could look at and work through and decide what you want to do. And I think another key consideration here is that because obviously money is tight and none of us can readily afford to contribute £1,000 or more to offsetting these sorts of issues when times are tough, you should perhaps start thinking about involving your students and indeed your agents in this process. And as an example of how I think you could do that, I want to show you this screenshot. Some of you may have seen this already. This is a screenshot that I took from the Ryanair website when I was flying back home to Barcelona recently. And I thought it was quite interesting. The first thing it tells us is that, yeah, every passenger on that flight is going to contribute 66 grams of CO2 per kilometer, which is, yeah, similar to the sort of figure we saw previously. And then it tells you how Ryanair is taking this sort of thing seriously and working to invest in greener aircraft and so on. But it also encourages passengers to contribute voluntarily to offset these emissions. You can see at the bottom of the screen, it says you can fully offset your CO2 emissions for €2.46 or partially offset them for €2. And because there's not very much difference between those two figures, logically most people would go for the fully offset option if they're going to go for it. And then here it explains the sort of thing that Ryanair is going to do with the money it collects from its passengers. Now, it seems to me this is a very interesting example of what we might consider doing. So the sort of thing that I envisage is that on your booking forms, you might add a couple of lines saying, will you be flying to study with us? Yes or no? If you are, would you be interested in contributing £3, £4, £5, whatever you decide, towards the cost of offsetting the greenhouse gases that you'll be generating? And I don't know, because we haven't put it into practice yet, but I would suspect that a fair proportion of students would be happy to contribute that sort of amount to this sort of project. And like Ryanair, you could then feature also on your website the sort of offsetting projects that you have decided to go with. And seems to be a little bit of outside interference, but never mind. So yeah, I think this is quite a nice model that schools based in the UK might like to consider following. And even students who don't want to contribute, and of course it has to be optional, it has to be voluntary, even those who don't, I think would probably be quite impressed by the fact that your school is taking this sort of thing seriously, is aware of the fact that flights generate greenhouse gases, which contributes to global warming, and so on. So at the very least, it would be a good PR exercise for you. Then we, having looked at what to measure, what not to measure, how to measure, and the three-step process in measuring, setting targets to reduce, and then strategies to achieve those targets, we're now into the last couple of slides, which are to do with auditing. In other words, measuring how you're getting on. And there are essentially three ways you can go about this. Option one is you could look after it internally. So you could appoint someone on your team to monitor what you're doing, whether you're achieving your targets and so on, which is something you should probably do anyway. Option two would be to hire an external auditing company, which there are quite a few of those out there at the moment. Sadly, they tend to be rather expensive. And of course, their expertise is not really in the language travel business. So last but not least, and very obviously, the answer is to use the Green Standard Schools self-assessment tool, which we have designed specifically to help language schools monitor their performance. Now, some of you are already familiar with this tool, but for those of you who aren't, let me briefly outline how it works. It consists of a series of 50 yes/no questions, which are divided into these 10 sections. So there's a whole section on energy, water, purchasing policies, recycling, accommodation, travel, teaching and training, and so on. And in every case, here's a screenshot of the first few questions on the form. In every case, as I say, it's a yes/no questions. Question number one is, do you monitor and record the amount of energy you use in your school, which is precisely what I'm suggesting you should do. And if you answer yes, then you have to show some evidence for this. And it says here it can be in the form of a document, photo, link, or comment. Now, obviously, if you're monitoring your energy use, the logical thing would be just to put it down in a simple Excel form. Then you upload the Excel to the platform, to the site, and we can then verify that what you say you are doing, you are indeed doing. And if you can put in a couple of invoices, a couple of your energy bills to verify that the Excel is accurate, then that's even better. Question number two on the form, again, have you undertaken to reduce your total energy? So again, we're back to measuring, number one, setting a target to reduce, number two. And again, if you answer yes, you're asked to provide some sort of evidence of this commitment. And in this case, it could be, I don't know, in a staff memo or something. Like, yeah, 2022, we aim to reduce our energy consumption by 4%. We need to work out between us how we can do that. Again, obviously in relation and to the total number of student hours taught. Question number three says, does your electricity supplier guarantees generate some or all of its electricity from renewable sources? Again, it's a yes or no question. If you answer yes, please provide some sort of evidence, which in this case may just be, a copy of your latest bill and a link to the website of your energy supplier, so we can verify that, what they're doing. So this is the way the assessment form works. It's a self-assessment. You go through it, you answer the questions, and you provide evidence of some description to verify your statements. There are 50 of the questions, as I mentioned, so it's not the sort of thing you can do in half an hour. It will take probably a few hours to do properly, but you can save what you've done, stop, go and have a cup of tea, come back and start again. You don't have to do it all at once. When you finish, you send it off to us, and our assessors go through it, and they award points for both for your answers and for the evidence provided. Okay, so the evidence is crucial. The maximum number of points available from the system is 200, and we've established that schools need to achieve a minimum of 130 points in order to be eligible for accreditation, which means you don't have to be perfect in every area. I mean, no school is. Every school has got issues that they need to address or things that they can improve on. But you do need to demonstrate a serious commitment to environmental sustainability across a wide range of issues, which are listed in those 10 areas that we looked at previously. Now, the truly amazing thing about this is that we provide this assessment and feedback to you completely free of charge. In other words, there's no commitment. We will go through the form, give some comments, tell you how you're doing, tell you what how we've evaluated your performance, whether you are eligible for accreditation or not, completely free of charge. The only time we would even consider sending anyone an invoice is if you have demonstrated that you are eligible for accreditation. In other words, you've achieved more than 130 points on the self-assessment, and then you decided that, yeah, you want to join a very talented band of people who are advertising themselves as committed to environmental sustainability. So that's essentially how our accreditation system works. You can, of course, find more details, more information on our website, which you have on your screen. And you can contact me at any time and ask me questions, which we'd be happy to respond to.